Yeah, thank you so much, worship team, for preparing our hearts. You know, I never had noticed this song before. Like the cornerstone, we focus on this foundation stone, right? But then this second verse talks about this anchor that holds within the veil. You know, it talks about darkness, and it talks about the storm. And I really appreciate the thought that went into preparing our hearts for the message today. And just this reminder, we're looking at an incredible passage today. I appreciate my mother-in-law reading that. You noticed that I gave her that passage with all those tough words. That wasn't the intent. Actually, I did it because I knew that she could read those things, all those words. So thank you so much for just setting the stage for the passage today, giving us a picture of where we're going. And what we find ourselves on today is this one final journey that Paul would take. And for me, this is just a passage that makes Paul legendary. I don't know if it is for you, but we see Paul's actions in this passage, and it's just incredible how this man would act in the circumstances that he's in. And I want to explore that today, just this idea of Paul and how he's in this circumstance, he's in this storm, but yet we see him respond in a way that just seems really unnatural. Looking at the passage directly before this journey seems like it could have even been avoided. We read at the end of Acts 26 in verses 31 through 32. It says, and it's talking about Festus after Paul had given his defense. And it says, when they had gone aside, they talked among themselves, saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. And then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And, I look at that and it makes you kind of think, what if Paul had not appealed to Caesar? It seems like that would have been a better situation for him, right? I mean, it seems like that would have given him more opportunities to spread the gospel. He wouldn't have been put into chains, right? But then, it's easy to forget what we've already seen before. Actually, when we look back to Acts 23, we see something pretty amazing happen. But it says, but following the night, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. And it reminds us that this was the path that Paul was supposed to take. It actually reminds us that this whole journey from Jerusalem was to end in Rome. And we even see through Paul's life his desire, this longing to go to Rome. I mean, we see it in Romans 15. It says, for this reason I also have much been hindered from coming to you, but I now long, having done all the things that I need to do, to come to you now. And we see that through his life, Paul really wanted to go to Rome. Being a Roman citizen, I don't know if it contributed to this. He wanted to see the glories of Rome, possibly. We know that there's this group of believers, and he wants to go visit them as well. So we see that this is his destination. This is where he really feels he needs to go. And it's interesting how Luke even writes, because in his gospel, the Gospel of Luke, in this book of Acts, he writes with this idea that some have referred to as the journey motif. And what we see in Luke is that 2/5 of the Gospel of Luke is written to record Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? But not only that, in Acts, what we see here is 1/3 of Paul's journey is from Jerusalem to Rome. Now, he's had a layover here in Caesarea for 2 years trying to get to the next step. And he finally, says that he wants to go before Caesar, and that's what initiates this journey to Rome. Maybe not the way that he thought he would travel to Rome, though, right? Yeah. So you see Paul's journey to Rome holds significance in Luke's account. And in both times, he spends a tremendous amount of time helping us understand how Jesus and Paul are getting to their final destination. I think that our mindset is that the best place for Paul to be is to be free. The best place is to be free of persecution, to be free of opposition that would hinder him from the message that he is trying to share. Free of even the shackles that would constrain him, right? So I think that, sorry, I lost my place here. Yeah, we see this different picture that emerges as we look at our text today. And it kind of goes around this idea here that freedom isn't dictated as much by our circumstances, but by our willingness to be in the center of God's will. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today as we go. Let's pray as we get started and get into this passage. Lord, we just thank you for the opportunity to open your word today. And Lord, I pray for your help today as we look at these things, that you would guide me by your Spirit, that you would open our hearts to hear the words of truth that are contained here today. I pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. So we see him embark on this journey. We learn a lot in the first two verses, too, of the chapter. It says that when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some of the other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship to Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. And Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So one thing we learn from the beginning is it says that we should sail. And what it reminds us is Luke was actually away, and Luke has now returned as a companion of Paul for this trip. So we see Luke return. Now we don't know where he was at. Some would say that he was actually out trying to prepare accounts for his Gospel of Luke at this time, and he was talking to different witnesses to Jesus at this time for that purpose. Now, we don't know why Luke wasn't with Paul for these 2 years while he was in Caesarea, but we do know that he returns now for this journey. But not only this, he's accompanied by Aristarchus. Now, Aristarchus was on Paul's journey with him to Jerusalem to deliver this money to the church in Jerusalem. We also know that he was seized in Ephesus by the crowd. And then also, we'll find out later that he was a prisoner in Rome, according to Colossians. So we see these men that are with Paul during this time. And one question arises when we consider their presence here, I believe. How were they able to accompany Paul? We have to remember that Paul was a prisoner on this trip, right? And I'm sure it wasn't like, hey, can I bring my buddies with me on this trip? Would that be okay? I don't know if that was something that was allowed. Some would even say that Aristarchus and Luke indentured themselves, became Paul's slaves so they could travel with him. Now, we don't know if that's the case or not. What we do see is that he was given favor among this centurion, Julius. And note the favor with this Roman cohort that is escorting him. We see this in verse 3 as this company arrives at their first stop on their journey. In Acts 27 verse 3 it says, "And the next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care." And it seems that Paul was no ordinary prisoner, but he was regarded as someone with integrity. To allow him to go and visit his friends is pretty amazing when you think about it. And I think it's the first hint that Paul was no ordinary prisoner. Given a leave of absence, he goes and sees his friends. And really, in many ways, he seems like a free man, even in this situation. He's given freedom in many ways as a prisoner. Now, unfortunately, the visit, we see it's short-lived because we now see them put out to sea. And in the coming verses, Luke records in detail their course. And I actually have a map here. This was really hard for me. I don't know if you guys are like me, but I have to see things to really grasp them in my mind. And it's talking about going under the lee of Cyprus and along the coast of Cilicia. And, I have no context for what that is. So I thought I'd put up a map today. Can you put that forward there? Perfect. Hopefully you guys can see that. It actually have the little line with how he traveled too. Hopefully that gives us an idea as we're going through this. But, as we look at this, we see he started in Caesarea and then moves up to Sidon. And then what we see is they now travel across the open sea, it says, under the lee of Cyprus. So we see Cyprus over here on the far right of the screen. And I guess under the lee would mean under the point that juts out from that side. They traveled under that because the winds, it was a difficult journey. The winds were against them, so they were using the island for cover. So we see them travel in this way, and then They crossed the open sea, past the coasts of Cilicia and Pamphylia. And I think sometimes we say, okay, we're just passing this, but I think this has tremendous significance for Paul, because this is where he was from. He was from Tarsus, right up in this area up here, Antioch. You see Antioch up in that area. That's where Paul was from. And you can imagine him in chains, passing his homeland, where I'm sure he had many friends and family in this place. And I'm sure it caused him to ponder maybe some of the choices he had made. You know, at one time, he was a prominent person. At one time, you know, he was well regarded. And now we see him in these chains heading towards Rome. I'm sure he thought a lot about the course that he had chosen as he is on his way. Now, we see them make port, and we see them make this port in a place called Myra. So we see Myra is up right below Lycia there. And here they change ships. Seems like the journey ahead required a larger ship. And what we find as we read later in the passage, this looks to be a grain freighter. It would have been a very large ship. It says that there were 276 people on board this ship. In fact, this was probably an imperial grain ship. It would have probably been coming from Egypt along the coast, and it would have been going to Rome for the winter season. And they had recently had famines that had decimated the population in Rome. So Claudius was actually using these ships to feed the people in Rome over the winter times. So these ships were pretty amazing too. It was really an incredible innovation. They were actually the largest ships on the open sea until the 1900s, when new ships actually came on that were bigger. So this is pretty incredible to think for almost 2,000 years that these ships were the things that transported grain and people at this time. But we see that they now jump on this ship with a larger crew, perhaps more passengers. What we find is that the journey becomes more difficult as they set out from Myra. And the sailing becomes slow, and they're pushed off their preferred course of travel. And you can see really what they would have liked to have done. Instead of going down here to Crete, they would have liked to have gone straight across here above Crete. But the winds pushed them from the north down below Crete. And it says they traveled with difficulty along this course, and they're forced to travel under the protection of Crete. And it says, coasting along, they finally arrive at the port called Fair Havens. We see that there on the map as well. They finally arrive at this port, and it says that in verse 9, their sailing now was dangerous because the fast was already over. So we see that the season is actually becoming a problem. Now the fast, this refers to the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. So I don't know if you are aware of what this is. This would have been the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It's when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and would atone for the sins of the people. It's known even today as the Sabbat of all Sabbats. And if you go to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem on this day, all the cars will be parked on the streets. The streets will be open. Children will be out playing on the streets because they don't do anything. It's a holy day. So now for travelers on the open sea, this had significant meaning for them, because this holiday happens normally between mid-September and October. And what it marks is this season that becomes dangerous for them to travel on the open seas. So from mid-September to November, journeys become perilous, and there's an increased threat of dangerous storms. Now, I'm from the southern United States, and we have something similar in the Caribbean. A lot of people from where I come from, they like to go on cruises in the Caribbean during the fall. So really from August to November, all the cruise lines, they discount their trips like they're really cheap. And this is because there's this dangerous time where they can have hurricanes in the Caribbean. So they make the trips really cheap, hoping people will buy them because of the dangerous season that it is. So it's similar here. Like it's a gamble now whether they should move north and move to Rome. And they know they have to get there by November, because really during the winter from November to mid-March, the voyage becomes completely impassable. There's no way that they can travel during these winter months. So they come to this costly decision. They're weighing whether they should go forward, whether they should stay in this port. And we see where Paul stands in verse 10, how he advises them. He says, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." First, once again, notice the freedom Paul is navigating with. He actually is part of the decision-making team. As a prisoner, he's actually in this meeting to decide what they should do. And his voice seems pretty prophetic, knowing what comes later in our account, right? But something was giving him hesitation to the fate that they would suffer if they traveled further. Now, is this a special revelation? Is this a gut feeling that he had? Now, we don't see an angel or someone appearing to him or him having a vision like we actually do in other places in Acts. He had, at times, special revelation from God. But I think it's important to note Paul's experience on the open sea here. And it's been estimated that through Paul's journeys, he had already traveled up to 3,500 miles or 5,600 kilometers on the oceans to this point. He had some experience about how they should travel. He had spent a tremendous amount of time on the open sea. But here's the thing, regardless, we see that those in charge, they decide against hearing Paul's counsel. And in verse 11, it says that the centurion, persuaded more by the helmsman and owner of the ship, decided to travel on and try to find a better port. And it seems their decision was based on the suitability of the harbor. I mean, it makes sense logically why they decided to move on. It doesn't seem that this port of Fair Havens gave enough shelter for them to shelter there through the winter. It wasn't protected in a way that would allow for that. So they decide to attempt to make it up the coast to a more suitable harbor at Phoenix. Now, they believe that this was maybe 40 miles up the coast on Crete. So this wasn't you can see it right there on the map. It doesn't seem like this was, that hard of a journey, right? Not only this, one thing that the text doesn't bring into play, but it's probably good to note, is that because this was an imperial grain ship, that the owner would have been insured against any loss that he would have incurred by the Roman Empire as well. So they weren't really worried if for some reason they lost the ship because of this. So for whatever reason, they decide to head out. And notice that they're kind of deceived into leading because they have this gentle south breeze that blows up. And supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. So they're trying to stay close to this island under its protection and make it to this next port. But unfortunately, we see that soon that proved to be a grave mistake, because they find themselves now in the worst case scenario. And this word Euroclydon comes up. This is an interesting word. It's not something that we really probably understand, but what we do understand now is that this was the most feared storm that they could be in. And this name actually gives us a hint to where it comes from, because it comes from the word Euroaquilo. And Euros actually means, it's Greek, and it means east wind. And aquilo is Latin for north wind. So what we're talking about is a northeaster. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with a northeaster, but in the northern hemisphere, in this part of the world, these are really dangerous storms because they move against the normal course of weather. Most of our weather comes from the west and moves east in the northern hemisphere, right? But now this storm is coming from the northeast in the exact opposite direction, so it brings tremendous winds into the equation. And you can see that it blows in from this northeasterly direction. And this makes it really, really dangerous for them to try to survive this storm. Prepared, and we see them understand how the situation that they're in at this point. We see them prepare the boat. They secured the lifeboat, and it seems like it was really tough to get this lifeboat secured. They cinched the ropes around the boat, or they frapped the boat with the planks. And this sounds interesting, but what they would have done, because of the amount of weight on board, the planks in a tumultuous sea, these planks would have started coming apart. So they would have taken ropes and they would have put them under the hull and cinched them up really tight to keep them together. It's kind of what happened to me last night after I ate all that food. I had to tighten my belt up so that everything wouldn't pop out, right? It's kind of that idea. And it's a way of strengthening the ship so that it can make it through the storm. There was nothing they could really do at this point. So what do? They lower the gear, they give way to the wind, and they allow it to drive them along. Now, unfortunately, this is really bad news because they could no longer steer into the wind. These ships, they weren't capable of steering against the weather, so they just had to be taken with the weather in order to stay together. And if you notice, it's blowing them in the exact opposite direction that they really want to go at this point. And especially out to the open sea, the Sea of Adri, you see here, into this area that becomes very dangerous. But not only this, fears arise as they recognize their course, because it says they have this fear that they're going to run aground on the Syrtis sands. And you can see the Syrtis sands, they're way down here on the coast of Africa. And you might say, well, what's so dangerous about that? Well, these sandbars were known as a point of no return. Once your ship got to these points, then you were dead in the water, you were shipwrecked. There's no escape from these sandbars that were there on the coast. But not only this, it shows us the strength of the storm. Because the distance from where they're at to these sandbars is 400 nautical miles, 740 kilometers. From where they're at to here, it shows you that this was a tremendously powerful storm that they're in. I'm sure a tremendously scary storm that they were in. And we see them begin to fear that if the storm doesn't let up, that all will be lost. And notice it causes them to take some drastic measures as the storm persists. And we see the first day, they throw over the cargo. I mean, I'm sure that they had some pretty precious cargo that they had with them. And the steps they take is to throw this cargo overboard. And then the next day, they throw over the ship's tackle. And I'm sure that this made it really difficult to steer the ship to actually, get back on track. But they are so worried about the situation they're in that they cut this away. And it brings them to this point where hope is lost. And we see this in verse 20, where Luke records, "Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat upon us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up." And they come to the moment where they resign themselves to their fate. They seem to finally get to the end of their rope. And they've done everything they can to ride out this storm. But I think the reality of the moment is really setting in. It's sinking in. And they resign themselves to the prospect that they're doomed. I think that there is something that is meant to happen in us when we read accounts like this. Because it's these stories like these that bring us to the place where I think joy and sorrow meet. The place where hope dawns from the darkness of impending doom. And I love J.R. Tolkien. And one of the ways that he used to write was with this idea of the eucatastrophe. It's a weird word, a eucatastrophe. Sounds odd, but according to Tolkien, this is what a eucatastrophe is. It's a story that often happens in the darkest moment. When all seems lost, when the enemy seems to have won, a sudden joyous turn for the better can emerge. And it delivers a deep emotional reaction in readers, a catch of the breath, a beat, and a lifting of the heart, he wrote. And this is the moment that Luke has brought us to in this account, a place that doesn't seem like there's any return from where they're going. And it's a critical place in our story, and it's at this moment that the man of God steps forward in freedom and assumes the captainship of the ship. Listen to how the man of God speaks and acts in the darkest moment. We see this starting in verse 21. It says, "But after a long absence from food. Then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted to you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it is.'" And you see this man step forward. And he's really the freest man on the ship. He steps forward and he brings a message of hope. He says, "Take heart. There will be no loss of life." He says, I think it's interesting because he really makes it clear here why they are in this situation they're in. He says, this is your own fault. You decided in this moment, to act in this way. But at the same time, notice the grace that he offers them. It was their actions that brought them to this moment, but grace that is had. Regardless of their actions, he says, strengthen yourselves because God is about to deliver you. And what brings someone to this point of complete assurance? I think with hearts melting all around him, how is he able to rise and speak of hope in this dire situation? Now you may say, well, Paul, he had an advantage. There's angels of God appearing to him, right? Reassuring him of what's coming. And we see that he's hearing direct messages from God. And, we might say, well, that seems different from the experience that I have. Maybe I haven't heard something directly from God. Maybe we have. But more importantly, I want you to recognize where it is that he found God in this moment. How he's able to hear from God. And I truly believe that Paul was able to step forward in this moment because he had learned to tame his own heart in the moment of chaos. And really when all hell was breaking loose, he was able to retreat to this quiet place and hear the voice of God. And what we find is that Paul, he was more driven along by the Spirit of God than the winds of this storm. I noticed something amazing. While the others were fasting out of anxiety, worrying about whether they could save their own lives, what do you find Paul doing? He's fasting. He's praying, but not for himself, but for others. It says that all in his ship would be delivered to him. That he was praying for this. And before, remember, he knew that they were going to lose things. He thought that life was going to be lost. But now the angel assures him that everyone would be saved. So I really believe that Paul was praying for those on the ship. He was fasting for the purpose of the lives of the others, that they would be saved as well. He knew that he would survive because God had told him that he must stand before Caesar, but now he's doing it for his companions. And it brings us to an important truth we can learn today, that Paul's example should encourage us to become men and women of God who are driven along by God's Spirit instead of the anxieties of our own hearts. Hear that again. To become men and women of God who are driven along by God's Spirit instead of the anxieties of our own hearts. That's a tough thing to do, isn't it? Yeah. But I think we must learn to find the quiet place in the midst of the storm. I think that our first tendency is to flail around. It's to rush around, to try to improve our situation on our own. We see the crew doing this. It's natural, right? Then we find Paul in the midst of the storm, and he's communing with his Father. This is the first thing he does, allowing himself to be driven along by the Spirit of God. Now you'll notice that the things here, they don't improve even though he encourages them with this truth. Notice the storms, they don't immediately evaporate. The waves, they don't stop crashing. They actually enter the 14th night of being driven across the Adriatic by this storm. But notice the flicker of hope in verse 27. It says They suspected that they were nearing land. Now some believe that it's likely they could at this point have heard waves crashing on the land. So it says that they take a sounding and recognize that the water is becoming shallower. And what they would have done was put a stone down into the water and measured on a rope how far they were. So we see 120 fathoms, and then 90. They notice that they're getting closer to some mass of land. And these things, they actually bring fears because they recognize, probably from hearing, that these waves are crashing on rocks. So what do? They put down the anchors to try to hold their position until daybreak. Try to hold on long enough where they can see where they're going and have a vision for where they're going next. But notice something sneaky happens once there seems to be an opportunity for escape. It says in verse 30, and the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, and when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out the anchors from the prow. It's like they were like, we're just going to go check on these anchors over here. We'll be back in a second. And they're like, well, why are you putting the boat down? It's one of these. But Paul, he senses this and recognizes their plans and warns Julius that their only hope of being saved is that if everyone stays on the ship. And I really love this part of the story because it gives us such a beautiful picture of the effect of grace that it has on us, which is that it causes us to become men and women of God who stand together unswayed by lesser hopes. Grace doesn't leave anyone behind. It doesn't serve our own interests at the expense of others. It rests in the fact that we cannot save ourselves. And notice the effect that Paul's leadership has on those on board the ship. It says that the soldiers cut the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. That's pretty amazing. That's their hope of survival, the rescue skiff. And it says that they cut it away. They believe Paul. And dawn breaks. Now notice it seems like we've gone back in time. Because if you look at the account, Luke mentions early in verse 27 that it was the 14th night, right? The 14th night had come. But now it says the dawn of the 14th day has come. How does that work? Because, we think, okay, day and then night comes later. But I think we have to remember we're looking at this from a Jewish perspective. And what we know about a Jewish perspective is that day begins and ends at sundown. And it's interesting that we see them fasting through the darkness of night, this 14th night. But then as the dawn breaks on the 14th day, Paul, he does something hopeful. And I want to read these verses with you because they're so important. Verses 33 through 38, they say, and as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eating nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head of any of you. And when he had said these things, look what he did next. He took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw off the wheat into the sea. It's interesting because it talks about he did this right before dawn. And it's just the idea, I don't know if you've ever experienced the darkness before the dawn. Many say that this is the darkest part of the night. When I was young, I had the opportunity, we would go on vacations on the Carolina coasts. And I went fishing on a pier overnight, and we stayed out all night fishing on this pier. And it was really interesting. I finally got to the end of this night, and I was so cold. I was like, oh man, why am I still here? It's so dark. Will this ever end? And then all of a sudden, being on the East Coast, you see the sun rising over the ocean. The dawn breaks. And it gives you hope, you get more energy all of a sudden, and you're like, okay, I could stay here all day. And we see Paul in this moment. He rises once again, and he brings hope to the situation. It says you can't see it yet, but this hope is coming. Take heart, eat something. This is for your strength because we're going to be saved today. And notice that he doesn't miss the opportunity in the midst of all to give thanks in their presence and break bread with them. That he actually proclaims the gospel in this moment, this dark moment. Talk about reflecting Jesus to a motley crew. I mean, we're talking about Roman soldiers, hated all over the Roman world. Sailors, I mean, we know what sailors are like, right? They're not talked about very, very kindly. And if you want to add one more, prisoners. He's on board with these type of men, yet he welcomes them to the table and he invites them to participate in the salvation that's coming. How can it remind us of the way that Jesus acted on the darkest night? I think it does remind us of this. As he was in the midst of the storm, he knew his fate on the cross was being secured. We see Jesus choose to take bread with sailors and sinners in the hope that was coming. You know, it's interesting because Tolkien wrote these stories of these eucatastrophes that I mentioned earlier because he knew that they pointed us to the greatest eucatastrophe our world has ever seen. Because for Tolkien himself, who was a Christian, the ultimate human example of this eucatastrophe was the life of Jesus, his birth and eventual resurrection. He's quoted as saying this, that there's no tale ever told that men would rather find was true. And notice the effect Paul's action would have on those on board. It says that they were encouraged. They actually began to eat as well after 14 days. Men and women of God, they bring hope to others. They cause others to look through the uncertainty around them and to see the hope that is coming. And notice the actions that they take. They're pretty drastic. It says in verse 38, they throw the weed overboard. I mean, that's their sustenance, their only chance of survival. Verse 40, they cast off the anchors. They throw the anchors into the sea. And then in verse 40, they loosen the ropes of the rudders. And they did this because they now needed the ability to maneuver the boat onto the beach. And we see them embrace, they free themselves of all these encumbrances that are holding them back. All these things that seem like they're actually the things that are sustaining them. They throw all of it off and they hoist the sail and they head for the shore. I think that we can learn a lot from the things that Luke includes in this account, because this last point, I think that in order to become men and women of God, we must be willing to cut the ties with anything holding us back from the hope that is coming. So my question to you today is, there's something holding you back from becoming a free man like Paul, a free woman? Something you just can't let go of today because you think it's sustaining you through the storms of life. And I think there's a lot of things that we can hold on to that we think are the things that are actually getting us through, when in reality they're the things that are holding us back. I wanted to just kind of end today with this story of this little lizard from C.S. Lewis. It comes from the book, The Great Divorce. I think it gives us a picture of these things that we think are helping us when in reality they're really not. It's a little long, I apologize for that, but I'm going to read this to you today. The story he tells here is a great one. It goes like this. Some people from hell are allowed to ride a bus trip up to the outskirts of heaven to see if they'd like to stay. And they get off the bus and find themselves in a beautiful valley, with heaven just over the mountains to the east. And the visitors from hell are surprised that compared with how normal they look back down below, now they seem faded like ghosts. And the heavenly beings who come to talk with them are solid and big and radiant. And at one point in the story, a man from hell is walking around carrying one particular sin, lust. It's a little red lizard sitting on his shoulder, flicking its tail and whispering lies in his ear. You can tell the guy hates the embarrassment of it. It hates its annoying chatter, but he won't let it go. He can't live with him without, it's a can't live with him, can't live without him kind of thing. So the man turns away from the mountains, keeping his distance from heaven. And a voice calls to him, "Off so soon?" It's an angel. The man admits that, yes, his pet, this little chap he calls him, doesn't really belong up here. The lizard had promised to keep quiet during the trip, he says, but the thing just won't shut up. So they're heading back down to hell. The lizard has promised heading back down to hell, where they belong. Would you like me to make him quiet? The angel asks. Of course I would, the ghost answers honestly. Then I will kill him, says the angel, stepping forward, ready to act immediately. The ghost freaks out, falling back with a howl of fright. He isn't ready for anything as drastic as killing his little darling. What plays out then for quite a while is the man bobbing and weaving with excuses and evasions, while the angel sincerely, repeatedly offers to kill the wretched lizard. Don't you want him dead? The angel presses him. Well, it's the only way, the angel explains. Gee, really? I'm not so sure. May I kill it? The angel asks again and again. But the guy can't believe he needs such an extreme remedy. He wants his little pet quiet and tame, but not dead. Yet the angel keeps insisting there's no other way, so may I kill it? Finally, the man gets angry, defensive, his feelings are hurt, and the angel is humiliating him. He says, making fun of him, he says, trying to pressure him, he says, into doing something against his will. Not at all, the angel says. I cannot kill it against your will, but it can be over with one bone-crushing decision. Okay then, the man finally gives in and agrees with a whimper. Go on, do what you like. Just get it over with. Though he's terrified at being separated from the little pleasure, with a sudden twist of a mighty hand, the angel squeezes the breath out of the filthy lizard, flinging its lifeless body to the ground. The man reels, screaming in agony, as if dying himself. All becomes still. Is that the end of it? Both of them dead? No. Suddenly that very man who'd been weak and whining stands boldly to his feet, a new man, noble, formidable, chiseled with strength, radiant with glory. And the lizard? Far from dying, it rises too into something new, a white stallion rippling with flesh and muscle, shaking its golden mane, greeting the man as a mighty servant. More swiftly than the storyteller can explain, man and horse head off at full gallop, not backward toward hell, but onward toward heaven, over the mountains, climbing impossible steeps, quicker every moment, till near the dim brow of the landscape, so high that I must strain my neck to see them, they vanished, bright themselves, into the rose brightness of the everlasting morning. You know, it's a picture of what we must do. We must cut ties with the things that are holding us back. And I love one of my favorite bands for King and Country. They sing this song, Burn the Ships. What would it be like if we were willing to burn the ships? If we were willing to cut the ties, smash the lizards, the things that are really holding us back from living the way that we're meant to live? What would it be like if we were to become men and women of God, cutting these ties for good? Well, first of all, I believe that it would cause us to find a newfound freedom, regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in. Notice that cutting these things away, freeing the udders, hoisting the sail, it didn't mean that everything went perfect from this point on. I mean, they still hit the reef. The prisoners were still almost killed by the soldiers. They still had to swim or find planks to make their way to shore. But here's the thing. They all made it to shore. And I could tell you this for sure, that the road ahead will not always be easy. And I can assure you that there will be storms, that your heart will be tempted to fail. But I can also tell you this, that our God will not leave you behind. That He will not let you sink. That He is bringing a salvation that you cannot imagine. And He's doing this with sinners like you and me. That's the good news. You know, I look at the men sitting around this table with Jesus. I look at those breaking bread with Paul on the ship. And I draw hope that God is saving both Jews and Greeks alike, both free men and women and slaves. That He's saving men and women just like you and me. And my hope is that you would live like free men and women that you are made to be. That you would learn to live in this same freedom that Paul has, regardless of whether you're in chains or not, because what we see today is a picture of a prisoner who in reality was the freest man on that ship. My encouragement to you today is to live freely, because this is possible in Jesus Christ. That you can become men and women of God who are driven along by the Spirit of God instead of the anxieties of your hearts. That you can become men and women of God who stand together unswayed by lesser hopes. And men and women of God who cut ties with anything holding you back other than the hope that is coming. So Lord, we thank you for this story that Luke's recorded. I thank you that from it we can understand how we can live free, how we can live for your glory, how we can live as men and women that pursue you. Thank you for this message. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.